Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. In this video, we're going to be connecting our new Blazor app to the API so that when a user logs in, they'll be authenticated against our API and get access to protected data. This is going to be a fairly dense lesson, so be sure to follow along closely and do what I do. Now, for those of you who are subscribers to my Patreon at the $5 per month level or higher, head on over to get today's source code so you can get a good copy to compare against what you do in this video. That way, if you have any bugs or issues, you can compare it against my finished source code and see what the differences are. You can also get last week's source code or last time's source code and use that as a fresh starting point for working on this video. That way you know that everything is in line with what I'm doing. Now, if you're new to this project, welcome. If you're just interested in this topic, I think this will give you a great real-world introduction to the topic. If you'd like to start the project from the beginning, there's a link in the description to get the whole playlist from start. Now, if you want offline access and access to a certificate of completion at each phase, and a whole bunch of other perks, you can go over to my website, iamtimcorey.com, and get the phase 1 and phase 2 sections of this course there. All right, let's head on over to Visual Studio. Now we're going to focus today in this web apps folder on the portal, which is our WPF WebAssembly it's our Blazor WebAssembly project. I was looking down here before. It's our Blazor WebAssembly project, which means that it needs an API to connect to. It can't directly access the data, which is great. That's fine, because we happen to have an API. Well, not happen to have. We designed it this way. We started off with our WPF user interface knowing we'd be adding other user interfaces, and we wanted to use the same business logic, the same data access, the same authentication, all of that. So we have the same system for our WPF project as for our Blazor WebAssembly project. Now, today's goal is to connect our portal to the API for authentication. Now, I have broken this video apart into two parts. The second part will be focused on actually creating the login and logout pages and using the authentication. But today we're going to set up the authentication so that it will connect to the API. Now the first step to do this is to add a couple of Nuget packages. So under dependencies, right click and say manage Nuget packages. You can also do this from the package manager console. I just prefer to do it here so I can show you how to search for these and find them. All right, the first one is going to be Microsoft, if I can spell it right, .aspnetcore.components .webassembly.authentication. All right, and because my font size is so large, it kind of scrolls off the page to say auth, but it really is authentication. Notice a mouse over it, you get the full name there. So this is going to allow us to do authentication inside Blazor WebAssembly. Now, when we created this project, we could have checked the box that says include authentication. We did not do that because I didn't want extra stuff coming in we had to take out. So instead, we're going to add in that system manually and do it step by step, just what we need. All right, so let's hit install. We accept the license agreement. And once that's installed, we're going to go back here to browse. We'll clear this out, and we will say we also want Blazor, so Blazor ed.local storage, which is right here. There's a lot of stuff that Chris provides for us, but Blazor.local storage is a really great tool that allows us access to local storage in Blazor applications. And you may say, wait, Tim, they just added in .NET 5 local storage access for Blazor server. That's the difference. Blazor WebAssembly doesn't have that library, at least not yet, but we do have Blazor.local storage, which does provide us that access, and it's a fairly common tool to be using. So let's install that. It'll give us very quick and easy access to our Blazor local storage. And local storage is going to allow us to write something to the user's storage on the client in their browser that will be stored even after they close their browser. Now, it's not going to be stored forever because the browser will clear it out sometimes, depending on how the user cleans up their computer. For example, if they use a cleaner or something like that, that's one of the things that often goes fairly quickly, is a delete local storage, which means you can't rely on it being there. So just note that it may be, if they clean their local storage out, this is gone. That's okay. We're not going to store anything there that is critical. We're just going to store the token so they can stay logged in. But if they clear it out, they just have to log in again. So those are the two Nuget packages we need to add. Now let's add a new file. Now I'm going to create a folder under the portal, and I'm going to call this Authentication. And I'm going to put everything for authentication in here. And the reason for this is because I like to, when I'm looking for authentication stuff, I like to find it all in one spot rather than having to hunt for, oh, is this bit over here and this bit over there? I like it all in one spot so I know where everything is. Authentication is complicated enough without having to also track down where everything is and keep track of where everything is. So this is just my attempt at making things a little simpler for us. The first thing I want to add is a new class. We're going to call this our Jwt Parser. Now, this class is one that has been kind of passed down from originally Steve Sanderson from Microsoft. He created this parser, and then it's been tweaked a little bit since then, and now we're going to use it. So this is one of those cases where a really smart person created something, and we're kind of building on the shoulders of giants. Now, a Jwt token is a standard format, okay? So we can parse that into the data it contains. And we're going to do that because we need to know what roles and what claims a user has, what their information is. So we want to capture all that information out of the token. So therefore, we need to parse that token in order to find those claims so that we can say, yes, you're allowed to go into an administrative area, or no, you're not. Okay, so some of this stuff's gonna be a little dense. That's okay. It's okay to say, yeah, I know what the code does per se, but not why it does that. That's okay. Some of this stuff is gonna be a little dense. The key is, in this particular case, just take the whole class. Now, I am not advocating that you take the whole class and not understand what it does. That's not a good practice. But sometimes when you're first learning something, it's okay to try it out just by typing it word for word, letter for letter, and get it to work. And then playing around with it and trying it again and again until things start to click and you start to see why. And sometimes part of that process is getting it to work, putting it in development, not production, putting a breakpoint in and watching what happens as you step through the code. Because that can be illuminating. And that means you have to have the code written before you understand it. So in this case, it's okay. Write it, get it to work, put that breakpoint in, follow what the code does, watch what it does, and learn. Don't stay ignorant. Don't just say, it works so I don't touch it. That's a bad place to be. But you can use it in development, test it, try it out, use that debugging process to help you learn what the code is doing. Let's start with private static byte array parse base 64 without padding. We're going to pass in our base 64 information. And inside here, we're going to say switch on the base64.length and modulo 4. So it's going to divide it by 4 and see if it is what the result is here. We're going to have two cases. That's what the leftover is. Sorry, not the result. The leftover. So in case you're not familiar with this right here, what it would be is if we said 4 divided by 2, the result would be 0 because 2 goes into 4 evenly. There's nothing remain. There's no remainder. This will provide the remainder. So if you said 5 divided by 2, the remainder would be 1. If you said, divided by 3, the remainder would be 2 because there's be 2 left over, okay? That's what we're working with here. There's 2 possibilities here. Case of 2. Now we're gonna say base 64 plus equals the double equals at the end. Oops. There we go. And break. And then we have case 3, the base 64 plus equals just an equals at the end, not 2 equals. So we're kind of evening it out. All right. And then return, convert from base 64 string, base 64. All right. So we're passing in this base 64 item. We're dividing the length by 4 and seeing if what the leftover is. If it's 2, then we add 2 equals at the end. If it's 3, we add 1 equal at the end. And then from there, we convert that from base 64 string to a byte array. All right. So that's the first thing we need to do. Now, from there, we need to private static void extract roles from JWT. A list of claim. And notice to add the system.security.claims to my list up here. We'll call that claims. And a dictionary of type string object for our key value pairs. And at the end of this, let's unpin this for now so we get a little more space here. It's going to be a lot of stuff that takes up a lot of space here. Key value pairs dot try get value claim types dot role out object roles. Okay, so what are we doing right here? Well, we are taking we're pulling from the key value pairs and looking for the role type in that list. If it finds it, then what we're going to do is extract the roles. So this try get value is to say, okay, here's the thing to look up. If you find it, then out, which means it creates a new object in this case, and it's going to be called roles. And that roles, if it exists, will be pulled out from that list of claim pairs. Okay, so if roles is not equal to null or is not null, how about that? Using the newer syntax. I love this format. I love the is not. All right, you can say not equals, that's fine. Var parsed roles equals roles to string. Trim it up. Then trim the start for this character. And trim the end for this character. And split on the comma. All right, so we're gonna parse all the roles the user has access to. If parsed roles.length is greater than 1. For each var parsed role, in parsed roles, there we go, claim dot add claims, there we go, dot add new claim types dot role and parsed role at position 0. Whoops, not that one. Parsed role trim. And we're going to trim out the quotes. Okay, so if we find more than one role, for each role we're going to add this, add the role type to our claims, and say they want to take this parsed role, the role you found, but take off the double quotes. Okay. Now note that we're adding it to this list of claims that's been passed in. So remember that when we pass in an object that is a class instance, like a list of claims is a list of T, and that's an instantiated item. So we pass that in, we're passing in a reference to it. Kind of that we're passing in the address of the house. And we're saying, okay, here's the address for this data. Well, we're kind of using that to say, okay, well, I know where the address is. Let's just add information into the house. We'll put information into the house. We don't have to pass that back then. That's just going to update that house so that whoever is passing information into this extract role from JWT, they're going to have access to that same location. Now they just have more claims. Okay, so that's the if the length is greater than 1. Now we're going to say else claims.add new claim types role parsed roles at position 0. There we go. So we're going to add just the one role if we only have one role. Okay, but if you have multiple, we're going to add each. And we're going to trim at the end, trim on both sides with the quotes. Okay, or remove it from the quotes. Now, at the very end of this, we're also going to say key value pairs. Right down here, key value pairs dot remove claim types role. All right, so if we found that up here, because we're in the is not null, so we found it in this key value pair list. Remember, this is another instantiated object, therefore we just have the address to this location. We're going to take out the role from that list. That way we can ensure that it's not double processed. Okay, so we've processed it, we've extracted the claims, and now we've removed that item from the list, and you just add to the claims list. Okay, these are both setup methods for our kind of a real method. Public static IEnumerable of type claim. And we're going to say parse claims from JWT, string JWT, like so. Oh, we should also make this the class static as well. So we're going to parse the claims from the JWT. So you pass in a JWT, you get back an IEnumerable of claim, all right, which we get a whole bunch of claims. So var claims equals new list of claim. All right, and we're going to say var payload equals JWT dot split on the dot and we're only going to take the item at the second position. This was called the payload section. So there is header information, then there's a dot, then there's payload information, then there's a dot, and then there is verification or validation information third. So we're going to take just the payload information. The payload is what has all the data that we need from our JWT. Okay, so we're going to grab just the payload. Var JSON bytes equals parse space 64 without padding payload. All right, so we're going to grab the bytes, the JSON bytes, and then we're going to say var key value pairs equals JSON serializer. And it should have, yes, using system.text.json up here. It added that for us. So if it doesn't add it for you, just add that using statement up there. JSON serializer dot deserialize dictionary of type string object and pass in the JSON bytes. Okay, so we're going to break down these bytes. We're going to deserialize them into the key value pairs. Once we do that, we're going to say extract from JWT. We're going to pass in our claims and our key value pairs. Remember though, that this is doing actions on both of them. Claims dot add range key value pairs dot select. We're gonna say, oops, select KVP, our arrow, new claim KVP dot key and KVP dot value dot toString. So what we're doing here is we're adding any claims to our claims that are in the key value pairs. But remember that at the very end of this, if we found the roles, we first extracted the role information and then removed that key value pair. That way, the roles aren't going to be in there twice because we also then added our roles to the claims. Roles are a little bit different in how they are sent across. And so we need to make sure that we put them in properly as claims. So therefore we did our manual parsing of those roles. We add them to our list of claims and remove them from the key value pairs. So now they're already in the list of claims. They don't need to be added again. But for everything else in the key value pairs list, we're going to grab the key and the value, going value.toString, and adding those as claims to the list. So those are all our claims. And we'll say return claims. Okay, so you may be asking, what are claims? What's the information about claims and why is it important? Well, this is where we're going to get information about the logged in user. There can be a lot of things you can use claims for, but for us, we've used claims specifically for the role information so that we know what roles they have access to. Is it admin? Is it cashier? Is it, I think it's a user is another one, I'm not positive. But then also have other information like their email address and their first name, I believe. So we can't have other information we pass through. We don't pass a lot of information though through about our user. We use a separate API call after the initial call to pass additional kind of information about the user, metadata, I guess you'd call it, but that's not pertaining to security. It's more first and last name, and we can pass phone number or anything else we want in that separate call. We don't have to add it to the authentication system and put it into the token. The token does have a limit in how big it can be. Now, we could have a really large token. We're not anywhere near using the space we have available to us for the token, but I tend to only put in the token what we need for security, and for everything else, I have a separate call for that. It's up to you if you want to do that or not. And that's all we're going to do for the Jwt Parser. This is a kind of a self-contained utility now that's going to take in the Jwt and pass out the list of claims. That's exactly what we need in order to process this information cleanly. Let's close this out. Go back to Solution Explorer. We're going to add another item to authentication. And we're going to call this our auth state provider. And in here, we're actually going to inherit from authentication state provider, which notice is a ASP.NET Core components authorization element. So it's going to add a using statement at the top, right there. Okay, so it didn't add it for you. You'd have to manually add it, right? Now, we need to, first of all, create a constructor. We'll take care of that, the red squigglies in just a minute. Okay, constructor, we're going to pass in HTTP client. Notice another using statement there on line 5 using system.net.http. And we'll say, call us HTTP client. And then we also want an iLocal storage service, which is going to bring in another using statement for blazor.localstorage. And that's now on line 1 using blazor.localstorage. And we'll call this local storage. And then what we're going to do is we will make sure that we create our create our fields for HTTP client and also local storage. Sounds good. We also need to add one more element, which is a private read-only authentication state. And we'll call this anonymous. And we're going to use this to return a status of anonymous, which means you're not logged in, essentially. We're going to use this in places where we don't know what the user is. Maybe the credentials come back bad, or we just don't know who they are. We can return this authentication state of anonymous. Okay, down here, we're going to have a public override of the get authentication state async, which is going to need to be public override async task of authentication state get authentication state async. We're going to take out the not implemented exception. We're going to implement it. var token equals await local storage dot get item async. Oops, not string. Get item async. There we go. Get item async, and it's going to string, and the key is auth token. Now we can make this key whatever we want. I am roughing this in right now. Okay, I want to extract this into a some kind of string constant that we put somewhere. I want to think about this a little bit, but here's the deal. We're going to write a lot of code today. We're going to write a lot of code today. And so we've already written a lot of code. Just the Jwt Parser is something that I'd probably want to test out, and probably should have created a unit test and tested it. But we're going to write a lot of code. And so instead of creating more code now and trying to do everything perfect, what I'm going to do is get things in place and working, and then come back through and optimize them. Because if you optimize them now, which we could do, but if you do, and then you have any kind of problems with your code, you don't know if the problem is the optimization or if it's the code itself. So instead, get something working, then optimize. That way, if you optimize something, you try it again and it breaks, you know it's the optimization that broke it, not the code itself. Okay, so we're going to say if string is null or white space token, then return anonymous. Okay, so if that token is empty, then return anonymous. So we're looking at local storage for the auth token. How do we know it's called auth token? Well, that's what we made up. Okay, that's where we're going to store our token, is in the key auth token. If it's not there, then we're going to return the anonymous, which means you're not logged in. So when you call this get authentication state, when you're asking for are you authenticated, we're going to look up in the local storage to find the token. And if it's not found, then you're not logged in. Now, if it is found, because that return is going to stop the method right there, but if it is found, then HTTP client default header request headers dot authorization equals new authentication header value, which that's under system.net. Let's take care of that. My goodness. Then do a control dot to add a using there. There we go. New authentication value, we're going to say bearer and pass in the token. So we're going to say that when we check the authentication state, if they are authenticated, we're going to add the token in as the bearer in the header. Return new authentication state, new claims principal, which we can again shorten. So let's do that. Control dot to add the using for system.security.claims. Claims principal, new claims identity. And inside here, the Jwt Parser dot parse claim from Jwt, pass in the token, and then comma, I know it's going to scroll, so let's scroll over here so you can see it. Pass in Jwt auth type. Okay, so that's the authentication type, is going to be passing in our token. So we're going to return the authentication state, which is a new claims principal, which is a new claims identity, takes in a new claims identity, which takes in the two pieces, which are the claims, and then also what type of authentication it is. So this is where we're parsing our token, which returns a list of claims, which is what the IEnumerable claim is what it's expecting in the claims identity. So we're saying, hey, here's a list of claims. And by the way, the type is Jwt auth type. That's the type of authentication it is. So that creates a claims identity. The claims principal takes in a claims identity. And then from there, the authentication state takes in a claims principal. Confusing yet? Well, yeah, I get how it could be. So let's give us some space here. We have a little bit of hierarchy, a little bit less scrolling to do. That's our return, which is going to be the authentication state for the user. Okay, so that is the get authentication state async. We now need to go down here and say public void notify user authentication. Pass in the token. And we're going to say var authenticated user equals new claims principal. New, in fact, you know what? Let's just take from here down like so, instead of typing it all out again. There we go. That's going to grab our claims principal, which is our new authenticated user information. And so now I can say var auth state equals task.from result, new authentication state, authenticated user, notify authentication state changed, and pass in the auth state. So you have an event here that's going to say, okay, we've changed the login status of the user. Maybe the user just logged in or they just logged out. Either way, it's going to, whenever you log in, it's going to flag that, hey, somebody's logged in and here's the new authentication state, and pass in that state so that we can read that and capture that information. So that's the event we're going to trigger, is notify authentication state changed whenever the state is changed. There's another one though for logout, public void notify user logout. This is going to be a little bit easier to understand what it's doing. Var auth state equals task.fromResult anonymous. What does that mean? You're logged out. All right, so notify of authentication state changed, and there's the auth state, which is we're logged out. So we want to notify someone that we're logged out. We're going to pass in an anonymous object, and we're going to say, okay, I want you to alert that this is the new state of the user, which is logged out. Okay, we're almost through the hard part, all right? This is complicated stuff. If you were expecting me to boil it down into something really simple, I'm sorry, okay? This is about as simple as I can make it, and I know it's not simple. And I'd love to make it simpler. The problem is that authentication is complex. And you really, in some ways, you don't want it to be too simple. You want some complexity here because you want the options set right. But at the same time, yes, we have a long way to go when it comes to authentication systems because this is too complex. We need to boil this down a lot better. And it is something I'm looking into, working with some people on, and that is creating a very simple system that we can connect that we know is going to work right and that is open source and that is discoverable. At the same time, it takes a lot of this complexity out because this is so complex that it's hard sometimes to not create mistakes because you don't quite know what everything's going on. It takes a while to understand it. And oftentimes the default action is, well, I got it to work, therefore let's move on. And I understand that philosophy. I understand that feeling that we just don't have time to keep going over this when it works. But don't do that, okay? You need to spend some time, understand the flow, understand why it's doing what it's doing, when it's calling these different things, and what the purpose is. Because if you don't understand the flow, you won't understand when you introduce a bug. And you won't understand when you introduce a security flaw. So pay attention to this stuff. Walk the process through. We're going to finish this process up. We're going to get it working. And then next week, we're going to add in a login screen, a logout screen, and start using this. And at that point, I want you to start using your breakpoints. I want you to start walking through this process so you understand it. Maybe you just type and follow along, but at that point, the next lesson we do, when we get to work with the API and we can see the process going, I want you to step through that code because you need to understand this, okay? This is your application's security. If you don't understand it, how do you know there's no holes in the wall? All right, so that's my last stay on the soapbox, at least for now. But let's move on because now it's time to create something that's probably a little more familiar with you, and that is some models. So we're going to add a new folder called models, and we're going to add a class. Let's call this one Authentication User Model. And in here, this is what the model we're going to use to log a user in. This is the information we have to send to the API to say this user wants access. Well, that's a email address and password. So prop string email, prop string password. Now, I could be done there, but let's go ahead and add a required and put a message that says something like your email address is required. And notice I also did add the using statement up here for system.componentModel.data annotations. And then required down here. And the error message will be password is required. All right, so now we have a username and password. That's all there is for the authentication user model. That's going to be what we use during the authentication process to say, okay, this user has given us the credentials. Is that valid? Okay. Now, we're going to have a return as well. So let's right click on models and say add new class. We're going to call this authenticated user model. And we know we have two return types from, or two return values from our API based upon testing. String access token and string username. These are the two things that our API will send to us. All right, and we know that because we've done it before. We've done it in the WPF project. In fact, if we go here in our models, I believe it's in here somewhere. We would have authenticated user model. There we go. Authenticated user gets the access token and username. So same thing in our library for our user interface, which is WPF, is what we're using in our interface for our Blazor WebAssembly project. Could we share models? Yeah, probably. And that's probably one of the improvements we make is to create a separate models project, which is shared by more than one user interface project. That makes sense because we're going to use the same API to access the same stuff. So yes, we're going to do that. But again, we're roughing this in. We're getting this going. We're not necessarily making it perfect on the first pass. We will get to that, but let's do it one step at a time. Okay, it's time to add to another thing to our authentication folder. And this is going to be the Authentication Service. This was going to do the actual work of logging us in and out. All right, so create a constructor first. And in here, we'll ask for HTTP client. Add the using statement. We'll call it client. And then we'll ask for the authentication state provider. And add another using statement up there. And we'll pass in the auth, we'll call it auth state provider. And one more is the local storage service. We'll call it local storage. And we're going to, yes, this is scrolling off the page. So what we're going to do is there's a new refactoring in the quick actions refactoring, right clicked or control dot. And you can say wrap every parameter and then say which type of wrapping you want to do. That one's fine. So we have our three items here, the HTTP client, the authentication state provider, and the local storage service. So we're going to do a control dot and create a field for each of them. There we go. So now we have a field for each of those up here that we can then use in other methods inside of our class, which is what we're going to do next. We're going to create two methods here. The first one's going to be public async task of type authenticated user model. And that's going to add a using statement. We're going to say login, pass in authentication user model, and user for authentication. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so this is where the naming, maybe you want to change it if it doesn't make sense to you. It seems to make sense to me. The authentication user model is that email address and password. The authenticated user model is the result. Okay, so this is the request, this is the result. Okay, so we have our login. We're going to say var data equals new form URL encoded content, new array. There we go. New array, and let's put our curly braces inside here. New key value pair string. The grant type is going to be password. Now, does this look familiar to you? Let's put a comma here. Well, let's put a semicolon at the end. I'm gonna go look for this. This should look familiar to you. We're gonna have two more of these in here. But if we go to our Solution Explorer and go back to our WPF library, or our class library for WPF project, and we go to, I believe it's the API helper, and we come in here. There we go. See that? We're doing the exact same call here, except that we're doing it in the Blazor WebAssembly project instead of the WPF project. So in fact, I'm going to copy these two lines, including the comma. I come back over here, paste it in. Now, username and password, don't have that. Well, we do. User for authentication dot email. And user for authentication password. Okay, so that's the authentication user model. That's the request. And so we're going to say, hey, I want to do a grant type of password. There's my email and password. We're going to form encode that, and then we're going to call our API. So var auth result equals await client dot post async. We need a URL here. Let's just do HTTPS localhost port 5001/token. This is going to be our API for now. Again, this is roughing it in. We're going to put this into our into somewhere else. We have a Blazor WebAssembly, so we don't have an app settings.json, but we can figure out somewhere to put this that's a string constant of some kind. And actually, you could probably put this into some type of changeable thing outside the build process, so that we can change it during our deployment process as well. So this is not the end spot for this, okay? This is not where I would leave this, because then it will only work if your API is at the local host port 5001, which makes no sense. Because in the real world, when you publish this to production, you're not going to have your API at localhost. So this is going to change. That's okay. We're going to pass in the data as our payload. Right? So that's going to give us the result. So var auth content equals await auth result dot content dot read as string async. So grab the result and put it into auth content. If auth result dot is success status equals false. Now, I could have said, put the bang in front of this and taken this out. Okay, that would have worked. But notice how easily this blends in with this. I'm not a big fan of that. Therefore, I'm going to say equals false and be explicit about it. Again, remember that code is meant to be read by humans, not computers. Humans. Therefore, the easier you make it to read, the better it's going to be. So, if it's false, then return null. Meaning, if you have not had a successful call, then just say null for your authenticated user model. That means you haven't logged in. And when we go to check that, remember back in the, let's go back to our auth state provider. When we do the check, if it's null or white space, the token, then return anonymous. That even if we, capture the token and save that, if it's null, which we're not going to save it, but if we did, it would still come back as null, therefore it would still be marked as anonymous. So either way, if this fails, for whatever reason, you're not going to be authenticated, which makes sense. The only way you can be authenticated is if this returns a valid token that says you are. In any other case, you're not authenticated. So if it's not null, if it's not unsuccessful. So if it is successful, then what we're going to do is say var result equals JSON serializer, which that is add a using statement again. Notice there's a lot more using statements here. I'll try and scroll up to the top and make sure you get all the using statements just in case you don't. If you ever have a red squiggly on something that isn't on mine, do a control dot and just see if it says add using. If it does, do that, and then you're good to go. Okay. JSON serializer dot deserialize to authenticated user model. The auth content with, let's leave it alone. We could do, so there's an option here. I want to point out, let me put it in the code just so you can see it. The option is to say new JSON serializer options. And then inside these options, let's put a close curly brace so we have it. Let's do this. Let's put this down here and this down here so that this is more readable. The options can be property name case insensitive equals true. Okay, and there are other things you can do in here. Notice the other options, but by saying property name case insensitive, if you didn't control the API and you wanted to make sure that it matched, even if your case sensitivity is different. For example, JSON typically is camel case, meaning the first word is all lowercase, whereas C# tends to be Pascal case, which is every word gets the first letter capitalized. By saying property name case insensitive, what you can do is take in valid JSON, which is camel case, and essentially convert it to Pascal case with just this ignoring case sensitive. Okay, so basically saying, I don't care if it's case sensitive in C#, make the comparison case insensitive so it puts it in the right places. So in our case, it doesn't matter because we control the API and the API is valid, I believe. But either way, that's going to ensure that our results are correct. Now, we capture the result. We've deserialized the value into the authenticated user model and put that into result, right? Well, now we're going to say await local storage dot set item async, and the key is going to be auth token, and the result, and we're going to say result dot access token. Okay, so if this is a valid success code, then we're going to deserialize into this authenticated user model, this right here, which has two things in it. the username and the access token. We're going to store the access token in local storage under the key auth token. Remember auth token? That we used over here, right there, where we looked for auth token to find out if there's a token already stored in local storage. Well, this is where we store it. So we are storing it in local storage. And notice how easy it is to store stuff in local storage. It's just set item async, you give it the key and the value. So really easy to use. You only have a limited amount of space. I think it's 5 megabytes unless they've changed it more recently. But you can't store infinite stuff, okay? And it is volatile, it's gonna go away. But this can be a great place to cache information, especially for offline use. All right, now that we have that done, now what we're gonna do is we're going to notify the user, or notify the system, I guess you'd say. So we're gonna say two parens to open, auth state provider, dot notify user authentication result dot access token. So we're going to trigger that notify the user, which if we go over to the this right here, the notify user passes the token. It's going to trigger that state change for authentication after it has parsed the claims and created that auth state. Okay, so it's going to parse all the token information into claims, and then it's going to notify the system that the state has changed with all the claims associated with our logged in user. Okay. Plus, one more thing to do, and that is on our HTTP client, we're going to say default request headers authorization equals new authentication header value, which wants me to put the whole name. Let's do a control dot here to add the using system.net.http.headers. Make that a little shorter and say bearer and result dot access token. So whenever we make a call now using our HTTP client, which will cover all HTTP clients, it's going to add the header for authorization that says bearer and the token, so that now our calls are authenticated. And then return result. There we go. That is the login method. Now, if you have a login method, you should probably have a logout method. So public async task logout. Now the cool thing is logout, it's a lot easier to do. Await local storage dot remove item async auth token. Don't forget to do this step. If you don't remove the token, even if you were to do other things like say, hey, they've logged out, that token's still there. The next time they check for the token, it's gonna say, oh, there's a token, and basically log them back in. So you have to get rid of that item in local storage. Don't just clear local storage, because we are right now just using local storage for our token, which is not very much. But if we were to use our local storage for other things as well, when they logged out, clearing local storage would delete everything. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you're saying, you know what? Yeah, but if they stored something locally that pertained to something like, I don't know, their security clearance. So maybe they have, offline report information. And that's sensitive information, semi-sensitive. So we put that in local storage for caching purposes, but when they log off, we want to get rid of that as well. That's something to think about, but that's not something I would do here. What I would do is I would listen for the log off notification. I would subscribe to that event, and then I would do a clear somewhere else that does that. So just know I wouldn't put the clear here, even if you're thinking, well, I want to clear everything, because there's some things that may not want to be cleared because they're not pertaining to a particular user or security login. For instance, maybe you keep track of the last 3 people that logged in at the station for quicker access to fill in their username. Okay, so you can click on their username and just type their password in. Well, that would not be something you want to clear out if one person logged off, because that would clear for everybody. It'd be a mess. So just want to point that out real quick. All right, auth state provider. We're doing this cast here so it knows what type it is. Auth state provider. Okay, because auth state provider is it's an authentication state provider. So we asked for it as an authentication state provider, which means in our dependency injection system, we're going to ask for, hey, give me your authentication state provider. But that's going to be our custom auth state provider. Okay, so this is from Microsoft, this authorization.authentication state provider. But what we've done is we have kind of extended that with a child class that has some more stuff. For example, it has the notify user authentication and notify user logout. So because it has that extra stuff, we can't call that extra stuff unless we first cast it to the right type. Okay, that has the additional stuff we need, like the notify user logout. So if we had just said, let me just show you here. We had that, it's going to say, I don't know what that, because the authentication state provider does not have a method called notify user logout. But if we cast it to type auth state provider, which that's what this is right here, is a cast, but then you wrap the whole thing in parens so that we can then say dot and be able to access those additional methods. So notify of logout, and then also one more thing, client dot default request headers dot authorization equals null. Wipe out the request headers as well, so that if they're calling the API, they don't have access to sensitive data because we're wiping out those authorizations. Okay, so those 3 lines are all we need to log out. Log in, a little more stuff to do, but log out is a pretty simple process. Now we are almost done. So let's close out of these 2, go back to our Solution Explorer. I'll pin this for now. And let's collapse down our WPF so it's not in the way. Let's go to program.cs. And in here, actually, let's unpin it again. In here, we have our setup for our dependency injection system. Okay, so we need to add a couple of things here. And let's do them right here, but I'll leave a space in between on both sides. We're going to say builder.services.add scoped. And we'll say I authentication do I spell it right? Service. We'll do a control dot here to, nope, that's not right. Oh, you know why it's not right? I know why it's not right. Watch this. Authentication service, which that's going to add a using to portal.authentication. And we're good. I never created an interface for this. So authentication service, this is what we just created with the login and log out. I want to create an interface for this, so control dot and say extract interface, which just to verify what it's going to do, create an I authentication service. It's going to put it in a new file. Okay, there we go. It's now implemented and it now also recognizes it. This allows us to replace this later and not affect any of our application as far as having to change code anywhere else. We can just use a different authentication service later if we want to, or even in our unit testing. builder.services.add Blazor local storage, which is going to add a using statement. Okay, so we got a using statement here for Blazor.local storage. Builder.services.add authorization core. That's going to add the .NET Core authorization. That's part of the Nuget package that we brought in with the system.NET or system.ASP.NET Core components.webassembly. I wasn't sure it was hosting. Maybe it added to the hosting as well. But anyways, that's part of the Nuget package we added for authentication. Okay. Next up is builder.services.add scoped for authentication state provider. All right, now this is a class, but the type we're going to give it is auth state provider, like so. Now remember before the auth state provider that implemented inherited from the class. So inherited from authentication state provider. Well, that's what we're going to expect everywhere as an authentication state provider. But we have our custom one that does additional stuff. And so we're passing that one in. Now, right now my code has to cast to this type in order to get additional stuff. We've got to think about that long term, because if we ever replace this with something else, we have to change those casts as well. So unless we then inherited from this class and did additional things. So that might be possible as well. But just note whenever we ask for authentication state provider, we're going to pass in ours. So that takes care of wiring up the dependency injection system. So now we ask for local storage or anything to do with authentication or auth state provider or authentication services, it will give us the right information. Okay. So one last thing to do in this lesson is we gotta go to app.razor. Now in here, we've got this router that's set up for not using authentication. There's no setup here for using authentication. So what we're gonna do is change that. So if we found the route, right now it just says, okay, go to it. Well, we're gonna change that to authorize route view, which is going to yell at me because it says, hey, I don't find that markup element. That's because we need to add some information to our imports.razor. So the first one we'll add right here using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.components.authorization. And the next one is going to be actually right above it. So using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authorization. Okay, we need to add these two using statements to our file. And I think what we'll do is we'll leave it like that for now. We'll probably need to add more when we create the login page, but we'll leave it like that for now. But notice now that it says authorize route view is fine because it knows about the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.components.authorization.authorize route view. But we need to do more in here than just go to the route. Let's take this slash off, which means we need a closing statement. But inside here, I want to have an authorizing tag. And you could have anything you want in here, but I'm just going to create it really simple and say text. We'll say, please wait. Wait. There we go. We are authorizing you. Okay, so if you find the route and we're in the process of authorizing them, meaning we're going out and figuring out if they're authorized or not, pulling in that JWT and parsing it from the local storage, then we'll see this text temporarily. It says, hey, just wait, we're authorizing you right now. Okay, and then it will just show them the route. But if they're in that state where we're kind of waiting on something, we don't want it to be a blank screen that looks like it's locked up. We're just going to tell them, hang on, it's coming. We'll get there, as soon as it's done, which should be very, very short. But just in case that happens, we want to make sure that that's shown. Now, for not found, we need to cut this out so we can wrap it in a cascading authentication state, and we'll paste it right back in. So this is going to say, hey, if it's not found, wrap it in this cascading authentication state so we can know what the information is about the user, because this is about the route, but yet we also need to know about the user, if they're logged in or not, and the information about them. And that's the last of our changes for this lesson. That was a lot, okay? That was absolutely a lot of changes. We have our 4 new items in the authentication section. We have our 2 models, which hopefully will get moved into a shared models at some point. And we have our modifications to our imports, our Razor, our app.razor, and our program.cs. Just a lot of stuff going on in this lesson. We could continue at this point and create a login page and our logout page, and then from there create a, we haven't even touched the idea of registering a user. We'll have to do that as well. But I think what I'll do is I'm going to stop the video here. We're going to come back to this in the next lesson where we create that login page and the logout page, test this against our actual API, make sure it's working, and then start doing some of the extraction to make it better. Take those constants out, and also have a place to put our URL so we can change it when we go through the publish process, so that we don't have to recompile our application every time we change our API's URL. So we'll do at least the login, logout, and testing in the next video. I don't want to leave you hanging forever though. So instead of doing every other week and being 2 weeks out to the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the next video the continuation of this, kind of like a part 2 to this, where we do the login and log out for our authentication system and do the testing of this code, because we really haven't tested this yet to make sure it works. It does work. I'm fairly confident of that, but we need to test it because it's a lot of code to type out. It's a lot of code to get right. And it's a lot of complex stuff. So we'll do that in the next video, which will be just a week from now. Okay. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, thoughts, concerns, things you want to bring up, leave them down below. I can't debug your problems necessarily. I can't give detailed views, and I don't necessarily have the time to even answer every question anymore. Sorry about that. I do try to answer as many as I can. And Tom, my community manager, helps out as well. But definitely leave them down below, because I'll take a peek at those comments and make sure that if you have thoughts, I at least write them down in my notepad of things to do later or things to think about. And if you have any thoughts on ways to make this even better or wrap this up into some type of quickly reusable drop-in system for a Blazor WebAssembly project, I'd love to hear them. Again, I can't debug your code or necessarily do a code review of it, but I'd love to at least hear you're working on it. So thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.